What would you do if you had 3 seconds to live? It's April 5th, 1945, and 19-year-old Chuck Joerger is about to find out. He's never been in combat before, never fired his guns at a real enemy. And now a German Messerschmitt is diving straight at him, cannons blazing, closing the distance at 400 miles per hour. Chuck fires back and misses. He fires again, still nothing. His guns are jamming. His training is useless. 2 seconds left. The German pilot has him perfectly lined up for the kill. 1 second. Then Chuck's brain does something that makes no sense. He stops aiming at the fighter. He aims at empty air and creates a glowing wall of bullets in the sky. The German sees it and breaks off instantly, choosing survival over the kill. In that moment of pure desperation, a terrified farm kid who'd been in Europe for 3 weeks just invented a combat tactic that would be studied for the next 80 years. He wasn't trying to be a genius. He was just too scared to die. The engines of heaven can wait coughed to life at 0647 hours, and Chuck felt the familiar shudder run through the aircraft's aluminum frame as all 4 Pratt & Whitney radials roared into their thunderous operational rhythm. He was already in position, wedged into the tail turret, a cramped plexiglass sphere barely large enough for a grown man to sit with his knees pulled up to his chest. Through the intercom, he could hear the pilot, Lieutenant James Keenan, running through the pre-flight checklist with his co-pilot, their voices calm and professional despite what lay ahead. Chuck tried to match their composure, but his heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he wondered if it would bruise. All around him, across the sprawling airfield, 36 B-24 Liberators were preparing for takeoff, each one carrying 10 men and 6,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs. The assembly would take nearly an hour, a carefully choreographed aerial ballet as bombers climbed through the cloud layer and formed up into their combat boxes, tight defensive formations, designed to maximize the overlapping fields of fire from their gun positions. Chuck had studied these formations in training, understood them in theory, but seeing them come together in practice, knowing that his life and the lives of 359 other men depended on everyone holding their exact position through flak and fighters, and fear made his stomach twist into knots. The takeoff was rougher than he expected. The Liberator, fully loaded with fuel and bombs, strained down the runway like an overweight bird struggling to become airborne, every rivet and weld groaning under the stress. Chuck's turret faced backward, giving him a disorienting view of the English countryside falling away beneath them as they clawed for altitude. The fields and hedgerows, the country lanes and stone farmhouses, all looked impossibly peaceful from up here, as if the war were happening on some other planet entirely. Within 20 minutes, they had punched through the cloud layer and emerged into brilliant sunshine at 12,000 feet, and Chuck watched as other bombers materialized out of the clouds like great silver whales breaching the surface of a white ocean. The formation took shape around them: lead squadron, high squadron, low squadron. Each bomber tucked so close to its neighbors that Chuck could see the faces of other tail gunners in their turrets. Young men just like him, scared just like him, trying to look brave for each other across the empty air. The intercom crackled with terse communication as the formation leader confirmed all aircraft were in position. And then, with a collective turn that looked almost graceful despite the brutal physics involved, the entire armada pointed its nose toward Germany. The flight across the English Channel and over occupied France was eerily quiet, broken only by the endless drone of the engines and the occasional radio check to confirm all gunners were alert and all systems operational. Chuck forced himself to scan his assigned sector, sweeping his twin .50 caliber machine guns through their full range of motion, searching the empty sky for threats he desperately hoped wouldn't appear. The guns felt heavy and cold, even through his thick gloves. He had fired thousands of rounds in training, but this was different. This was the weight of knowing that the next time he pulled these triggers, He would be trying to kill another human being, a man he'd never met, a man who was simultaneously trying to kill him. The moral complexity of it all threatened to overwhelm him, so he pushed it down, focused on the mechanical task at hand. Watch your sector, trust your training, protect your crew. At 10:23 hours, they crossed the Rhine, and Chuck felt the collective tension ratchet up across the entire formation. They were in Germany now, in the heart of enemy territory, and from here until they turned for home, every second was borrowed time. The flak started at 11:07 hours, and nothing in Chuck's training had prepared him for the reality of it. One moment, the sky was clear. The next it was erupting in black clouds of shrapnel as German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground opened fire, trying to bracket the formation with mathematically calculated precision. Each burst was a flower of death blooming in the air, and when they were close, Chuck could hear the shrapnel pinging off the Liberator's aluminum skin like deadly hail. The bombers held formation, held course, because deviating meant breaking. The defensive integrity of the combat box, and a bomber alone was a bomber dead. Through his intercom, Chuck heard the navigator calling out heading adjustments, heard the bombardier announce they were beginning their bomb run, and he knew what that meant. For the next 8 minutes, they would fly straight and level. No evasive action, no deviation, a perfect target while the bombardier lined up his crosshairs on the rail yards below. 8 minutes of absolute vulnerability. 8 minutes of flying through a storm of steel and fire, with no ability to dodge or weave. 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours. Chuck gripped his guns and watched his sector and prayed to a god he wasn't entirely sure he believed in anymore. Not after seeing what men did to each other in war. The bomb bay doors opened beneath the aircraft, and Chuck felt the familiar change in the plane's handling as drag increased and stability decreased. Through his turret, he could see other bombers in the formation releasing their loads. The bombs tumbling away in sticks of 12, falling toward targets he couldn't see from his position. The Liberator lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of weight suddenly disappeared from its belly, and then the bomb bay doors were closing, and Lieutenant Keenan's voice came over the intercom. Bombs away, good drop, let's go home. But they weren't home yet, not by a long shot. They still had to fly out of the flak zone, still had to cross back over all those hundreds of miles of hostile territory, and the Luftwaffe, Chuck knew from his briefings, preferred to attack bombers. On their way home, when they were lighter, lower on fuel, and psychologically relaxed after completing their mission. The flak began to thin as they turned away from Nuremberg, and for a brief moment, Chuck allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they would make it through this mission without seeing any fighters. That hope lasted exactly 4 more minutes, until his headset exploded with urgent voices. Bandits, 9 o'clock high. I got 3 more, 2 o'clock level. They're coming in. And then Chuck saw them, dark shapes diving out of the sun. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, Germany's best, and they were coming fast, very fast. And suddenly his training evaporated, replaced by something more primal, more fundamental. The raw, animal instinct to survive. The first German fighter came screaming in from Chuck's 7 o'clock position. Slightly high, a Focke-Wulf 190 painted in mottled gray-green. Camouflage with a yellow nose that caught the sunlight like a predator's. Chuck swung his turret to track it, his thumbs finding the firing buttons on his control grips. But the fighter was moving so much faster than any target he'd ever engaged in training that his mind struggled to process the geometry. The FW-190 opened fire at 400 yards, and Chuck saw the flicker of its wing-mounted cannons before he saw the tracers arcing toward him. Bright orange streaks that seemed to float lazily through the air until they suddenly snapped past his turret with the speed of thought. He pressed his triggers and felt his twin 50s roar to life, the recoil shuddering through the turret's frame, spent brass casings ejecting in a glittering stream. But his rounds were passing behind the fighter, behind and below, and the German pilot rolled away untouched, diving beneath the bomber's tail to set up another pass. Chuck's intercom was chaos now, every gunner calling out targets, the waist gunners firing in long chattering bursts, the ball turret operator beneath the fuselage, rotating frantically to track fighters coming from below. Someone was hit. Chuck heard screaming over the radio, couldn't tell who. And then a B-24 off their right wing took a direct hit in the number 3 engine, orange flame erupting from the cowling, and Chuck watched in horror as the bomber fell. Out of formation, trailing fire and smoke, men bailing out into the freezing air at 20,000 feet. The FW-190 came back for a second pass, and this time Chuck was ready. He had overcorrected on his first attempt, been too aggressive with his lead, and now he forced himself to relax, to breathe, to let his training take over. The fighter approached from 5 o'clock low, climbing as it came, and Chuck tracked it smoothly, leading it by what felt like an impossible amount. And when the range closed to 300 yards, he pressed his triggers and held them down, walking his tracers toward the fighter's flight path. He saw his rounds connect, saw pieces of the fighter's wing root tear away in a spray of aluminum fragments, saw the canopy shatter as a .50 caliber round punched through it, and then the FW-190 was rolling away, trailing glycol smoke from its punctured cooling system, spiraling down toward the German countryside far below. Chuck had just scored his first kill, but there was no time to process it, no time to feel anything at all, because 2 more fighters were already positioning for their attack runs, and the veteran Luftwaffe pilots had clearly identified the weakest bombers in the formation and were concentrating their attacks accordingly. ****. What happened next would be debated and analyzed by military historians for decades, but in the moment, it was pure instinct, pure desperation. A Messerschmitt 109 came boring in from directly astern, the worst possible angle, straight up the tail where Chuck's guns had maximum effectiveness, but where the fighter's profile was smallest, hardest to hit. Chuck fired, missed, fired again, and realized with dawning horror that his guns were starting to malfunction, the bitter cold at altitude causing the firing mechanisms to freeze up intermittently. He could see the Messerschmitt's propeller spinner, centered perfectly in his gun sight, could see the pilot's face behind the armored windscreen, and he knew with absolute certainty, that if this fighter got its guns on target, if those 20mm cannon shells started ripping through Heaven Can Wait's tail section, they were all dead. The Messerschmitt opened fire, and Chuck saw the muzzle flashes, and in that instant something inside him snapped. Some barrier between thought and action dissolved, and instead of trying to shoot the fighter down, he did something no tail gunner had ever been trained to do, something that seemed completely insane even as he was doing it. He stopped firing altogether, rotated his guns to the extreme limit of their upward traverse, and instead of aiming at the fighter, he aimed at the empty air directly in its flight path and opened fire, creating a wall of .50 caliber tracers that the Messerschmitt would have to fly through to complete its attack. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The German pilot, seeing the stream of tracers materialize directly ahead of him like a curtain of steel, broke off his attack run with barely a second to spare, rolling hard left to avoid flying into Chuck's fire. Chuck didn't stop there, didn't pause to marvel at what had worked. He kept firing, kept moving his tracer stream, herding the fighter away from the bomber's vulnerable tail like a sheepdog working an aggressive wolf away from the flock. The Messerschmitt's wingman, following close behind, saw what had happened to his leader and broke off his own attack before even getting into firing range. Unwilling to fly through that wall of death, the crazy American tail gunner had erected in midair. For 30 seconds, maybe 40, Chuck maintained his barrage, burning through his ammunition at a rate that would have gotten him court-martialed in training. But he wasn't in training anymore, and the tactic was working. The fighters circled, looking for a new angle of attack, but Chuck had bought his bomber precious seconds, and those seconds allowed Heaven Can Wait to tuck back deeper into the formation, where the overlapping fields of fire from other bombers made isolated attacks far more costly for the Luftwaffe. The immediate crisis had passed, but Chuck's ammunition counters were showing critically low levels, and they still had 200 miles to fly before reaching the relative safety of Allied-controlled airspace. The fighter attack had lasted only 7 minutes, but to Chuck it felt like 7 hours. His arms ached from wrestling the turret controls, his ears rang from the deafening hammering of his guns, and his flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the bone-chilling cold at altitude. Through his intercom, he heard Lieutenant Keenan taking a damage assessment from each crew position. The waist gunner reported hydraulic fluid spraying from a severed line. The radio operator said they'd taken hits through the fuselage, but nothing critical. The ball turret gunner's voice was shaky but functional. When Keenan called for Chuck's status, he replied with 2 words: tail intact. But his ammunition situation was desperate. He'd burned through nearly 70% of his rounds in that sustained barrage, that insane defensive curtain he'd thrown up out of pure survival instinct. And if the Luftwaffe came back for another pass, he wouldn't have enough bullets left to effectively defend his sector. He could see other bombers in the formation trailing damage, one with its entire vertical stabilizer shot away, somehow still flying through sheer pilot skill and aerodynamic miracle, another with an engine feathered and black smoke streaming from its wing root. The formation had tightened up after the attack, every pilot knowing that straggling meant death, that the Luftwaffe circled like sharks waiting for any bomber to fall behind, any bomber to show weakness. 10 minutes passed without contact. Then 20. Chuck forced himself to stay alert, scanning his sector in methodical sweeps, fighting against the adrenaline crash that threatened to overwhelm him. His hands had finally stopped shaking, replaced by a strange numbness that extended up his forearms into his shoulders. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves, trying to keep circulation going, trying to stay ready. The temperature in his turret had dropped to 30 degrees below zero, and ice crystals were forming on the inside of the plexiglass, where his breath condensed and froze. Through the intercom, the navigator announced they were crossing back over the Rhine, back into Allied territory, and Chuck felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made him dizzy. But the navigator's next words killed that relief instantly. Multiple bogies, 6 o'clock level, closing fast. Chuck's stomach dropped. The Luftwaffe was making one final attempt, one last try to knock down as many bombers as possible before they reached the safety of their fighter escort, which should be appearing any minute now, assuming the timing was right, assuming the P-51 Mustangs hadn't been delayed or diverted, assumptions that could get them all killed. 3 Messerschmitt 109s came in together this time. A coordinated attack from the tail quarter, exactly the kind of textbook assault that Luftwaffe veterans had perfected through years of combat experience. They were smart enough to spread out, forcing Chuck to choose which one to engage while the others pressed their attacks uncontested. Chuck made his decision in a heartbeat. He didn't try to shoot any of them down. Instead, he did exactly what had worked before, what his gut told him would work again, even though every manual and every instructor had said it was a waste of ammunition. He aimed into the empty air ahead of the lead Messerschmitt and opened fire, creating that lethal barrier of tracers, that visible wall of death no rational pilot would fly through. The lead fighter broke left. Chuck immediately shifted his fire to the path of the second fighter, who also broke off. The third Messerschmitt, seeing both his wingmen abort their runs, hesitated for a critical second, and that second was all the waist gunners needed to bracket him with fire from both sides of the fuselage. The German fighter erupted in flame and spun away, trailing parts and smoke, and the other 2 109s decided they'd had enough, peeling away to find easier targets elsewhere in the bomber stream. Chuck's ammunition counters hit 0 on his port gun, then 5 seconds later on his starboard gun. He was dry, completely out of bullets, And if another fighter came at them, now there was nothing he could do except watch it happen. But no more fighters came. Through the frozen plexiglass of his turret, Chuck saw the most beautiful sight of his young life. P-51 Mustangs, American fighters with their distinctive bubble canopies and checkered noses, racing up from below to take over escort duties. The Mustangs tore past the bomber formation at speeds that made the Liberators look like they were standing still, climbing toward the few remaining Luftwaffe fighters who immediately broke contact and fled east, unwilling to tangle with the superior American fighters. Lieutenant Keenan's voice came over the intercom, steady and calm despite everything they'd just survived. "Escorts here, boys. We're going home." Chuck let his head fall back against the padded rest behind him, closed his eyes, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. His whole body was trembling again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the slow, dawning realization that he was still alive, that they'd all survived, that his desperate, unorthodox tactic had actually worked not once but twice. The pice that flight back to England took another hour and 40 minutes, and Chuck spent most of it replaying those fighter attacks in his mind, analyzing what he'd done, trying to understand why it had been so effective. The Luftwaffe pilots were experienced, skilled, aggressive, but they were also rational. They'd been conditioned by hundreds of combat missions to respect the threat of defensive fire, to break off attacks when the risk became too high, by creating a visible barrier of tracers directly in their flight path. Chuck had forced them into an impossible choice: fly through certain damage to press their attacks, or break off and look for easier opportunities. Every pilot had chosen survival over target fixation, exactly as Chuck's instinct had predicted they would. He hadn't been trying to invent a new tactic. He'd just been trying not to die, and in that desperation, he'd stumbled onto something profound. Something that would change how tail gunners thought about their role in combat. Asterisk. Heaven can wait. Touchdown at Seething at 15:47 hours. And Chuck remained in his turret until the engines finally shut down and the sudden silence felt more overwhelming than the roar had been. His legs had gone numb from sitting cramped in the same position for nearly 9 hours, and when he tried to climb out of the turret, he nearly collapsed, caught by the waist gunner who'd been waiting to help him. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, immediately counting holes, assessing damage, and Chuck heard their low whistles as they discovered just how many times the bomber had been hit. 73 holes, they would count eventually. 73 places where German steel had punched through aluminum, any one of which could have been catastrophic if it had struck 6 inches in a different direction. Chuck's legs wobbled as he walked away from the aircraft, and he had to stop twice to vomit into the grass beside the hardstand, his body finally releasing all the fear and adrenaline it had been holding for the past 9 hours. No one said anything. No one had to. Every man who'd flown combat missions knew exactly what he was feeling, knew that hurling your guts out after your first mission was as natural as breathing. The debriefing took place in a Quonset hut that smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke and fear sweat that had soaked into the wooden chairs over hundreds of previous debriefings. Intelligence officers sat at tables with maps and notepads, asking each crew member to describe what they'd seen, where the flak had been heaviest, how many fighters had attacked, what types, from what angles, what damage they'd inflicted. When Chuck's turn came, he described his ammunition expenditure, and the intelligence officer's eyebrows rose sharply. "You burned through 80% of your ammunition in a 7-minute engagement?" the officer asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. Chuck nodded, waiting for the reprimand, waiting to be told he'd wasted precious rounds, but then Lieutenant Keenan spoke up from across the room. "That tail gunner saved this aircraft," Keenan said quietly. "I watched the gun camera footage being unloaded. Whatever he was doing back there, it worked. Those fighters broke off attacks they should have pressed home." The intelligence officer made a note. asked Chuck to describe his technique in detail. And Chuck did his best to explain what had seemed like pure instinct in the moment. How he'd stopped trying to hit the fighters and started trying to prevent them from hitting the bomber. Word spread quickly through the squadron, the way significant things always spread in military units. Through informal conversations in mess halls and crew quarters. Through maintenance personnel who'd heard things from other maintenance personnel. By the next morning, 3 other tail gunners approached Chuck asking him to explain exactly what he'd done, how he'd positioned his tracers, how far ahead of the fighters he'd aimed. Chuck tried to explain it, but the truth was he didn't entirely understand it himself. He'd acted on instinct, on desperation, on some subconscious calculation his rational mind hadn't been involved in making. One of the veteran gunners, a staff sergeant named Morrison who'd flown 28 missions, listened to Chuck's explanation and then nodded slowly. "Barrage fire," Morrison said. "You were laying down barrage fire like anti-aircraft guns do, but mobile, adaptive. You were turning your position into a no-fly zone." The term stuck. Within a week, other tail gunners in the squadron were experimenting with the technique. And within a month it had spread to other squadrons, other bomb groups. Modified and refined, but based on the fundamental principle Chuck had discovered. That sometimes the psychological effect of defensive fire mattered more than its accuracy. Chuck flew 34 more missions before the war in Europe ended. He refined his technique, learned when to use it and when traditional aimed fire was more appropriate, learned to conserve ammunition while still creating that crucial psychological barrier. He was credited with 3 confirmed kills and 2 probables. But his real contribution wasn't measured in destroyed aircraft. It was measured in the bomber crews who made it home because Luftwaffe fighters had broken off attacks they might otherwise have pressed. The Army Air Forces eventually incorporated elements of Chuck's innovation into their gunnery training curriculum, teaching tail gunners that defensive fire had 2 purposes: destroying enemy aircraft and deterring enemy attacks. And that sometimes the second purpose was more important than the first. They called it barrier gunnery in the training manuals, a sterile technical term that couldn't possibly capture what it felt like to invent it in the moment. With fighters boring in and your life measured in seconds and nothing but instinct to guide you. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, Chuck was 20 years old and felt 50. He'd seen things no person should see, done things no person should have to do, watched friends die in fire and steel and chaos. But he'd also discovered something essential about himself, something about human beings in general, that ordinary people, when pushed to the absolute limit of their endurance and their fear, sometimes find within themselves extraordinary solutions. He hadn't set out to revolutionize air combat tactics. He'd just been a terrified 19-year-old trying to survive his first mission. And in that terror, he'd accessed something deeper than training, something more fundamental than doctrine. He'd accessed the raw human capacity for innovation under pressure, the ability to see patterns and possibilities that no classroom could teach, no manual could anticipate. Years later, when military historians interviewed him about that April day in 1945, Chuck struggled to articulate what had gone through his mind in those critical seconds. "I just knew I couldn't let them through," he finally said. "And I figured out how." Chuck Joerger returned to Ohio in September 1945, carrying a Distinguished Flying Cross, an air medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, and memories that would wake him in the middle of the night for the next 50 years. He enrolled at Ohio State University on the GI Bill, studied engineering, married a girl named Dorothy who'd waited for him through the war, and built a quiet life that on the surface bore no resemblance to those violent months over Europe. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences, not because they were classified or because he was traumatized beyond speech, but because he'd discovered what so many veterans discover, that the people who needed to understand already did. And the people who hadn't been there could never truly comprehend, no matter how detailed the explanation. His war, like the wars of millions of other ordinary men who'd done extraordinary things, became a private thing. A sealed chapter he opened only occasionally, only carefully, only with others who'd lived through similar hells. But the innovation he'd stumbled upon that day, that desperate improvisation born of fear and instinct, lived on far beyond his own personal experience, evolving and spreading in ways he never anticipated and rarely witnessed. Firsthand, the tactical innovation that would later be formally designated as barrier gunnery or deterrent fire patterns found its way into military doctrine, not through official channels or command directives, but through the organic, ground-up transmission of knowledge that happens when people who actually do the fighting share what actually works. Tail gunners talk to other tail gunners. Squadron gunnery officers compared notes. After-action reports documented instances where defensive fire had caused enemy fighters to break off attacks even without scoring hits. Slowly, gradually, the understanding spread that gun cameras and kill counts told only part of the story. That the rounds you fired to prevent an attack were just as valuable as the rounds you fired to destroy an attacker. By the time the Korean War began in 1950, barrier gunnery had been incorporated into the training curriculum for defensive gunners on B-29 superfortresses, and pilots reported that MiG-15 fighters often broke off attacks when they encountered coordinated defensive fire, even when that fire wasn't particularly accurate. The same principle would appear decades later in different forms. Helicopter door gunners in Vietnam using suppressive fire to control landing zones. Fighter pilots employing defensive missile launches to force enemy aircraft into evasive maneuvers. Electronic warfare systems creating zones of denial through jamming and deception. The underlying concept remained constant, that defense wasn't just about destroying threats, but about convincing threats that the cost of attack exceeded the value of success. Chuck followed these developments from a distance, reading occasional articles in aviation magazines, attending a few reunions where old crew members traded stories over beer and cigarettes. But he never claimed credit for the innovation, never sought recognition or royalties or historical footnotes. When a researcher from the Air Force Historical Research Agency tracked him down in 1987 to interview him for a study on the evolution of bomber defensive tactics, Chuck was 62 years old, retired from a career in civil engineering, spending his days fishing and woodworking and helping Dorothy tend their garden. The researcher, a young captain with a PhD in military history, treated Chuck with the reverent awe usually reserved for generals and Medal of Honor recipients. But Chuck deflected the attention with characteristic modesty. "I was just trying not to get killed," he told the captain. Any other tail gunner in the same situation would have figured out the same thing. I wasn't special. The situation was special, and I got lucky. But the captain pressed him, wanted to understand the cognitive process, the split-second decision-making that had led to such a significant tactical breakthrough. And eventually Chuck tried to articulate something he'd been thinking about for 40 years, but had never quite put into words. "Here's what I figured out," Chuck said, leaning back in his chair, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of his living room. "Training teaches you what to do when everything goes according to plan. It gives you procedures, techniques, the accepted way of handling standard situations. And that's valuable, don't get me wrong. But combat doesn't care about your training. Combat gives you situations no instructor ever imagined, problems no manual ever addressed, and you've got maybe 2 seconds to figure out a solution or you die. What saved me that day wasn't anything they taught me in gunnery school. It was being willing to throw away everything they taught me when it wasn't working. Being willing to try something that probably seemed insane. Being willing to trust my gut when my gut said the rulebook was wrong. Every innovation in warfare, hell, every innovation in anything, comes from somebody being willing to say, The way we've always done it isn't working. Let me try something different. I just happened to be in a position where trying something different was the only option I had left." The captain nodded, scribbling notes, and then asked the question that military historians always ask, the question that Chuck had been dreading. How many lives did his innovation save? How many bomber crews made it home because Luftwaffe pilots broke off attacks they might otherwise have pressed? How do you quantify the impact of a tactical change that works precisely because it prevents things from happening? Chuck thought about that question for a long time before answering. Thought about all the tail gunners who'd used variations of his technique in the final months of World War II. Thought about the Korean War B-29 crews. Thought about all the ways his moment of desperate improvisation had rippled forward through time, influencing people he'd never meet in situations he'd never witness. "I have no idea," he finally said. "And I'm not sure it matters. What matters is that when one person figures out something that works, and they share it, and other people build on it and improve it and adapt it to their own situations, that's how we get better. That's how we survive things that should kill us. That's how ordinary people, regular folks who aren't geniuses or heroes or anything special, somehow muddle through impossible situations and come out the other side." He paused, smiled slightly, and added, "I was 19 years old and scared out of my mind, and I did something that seemed to work, and other guys tried it and refined it and made it better than I ever could have alone. That's not heroism. That's just human beings doing what human beings do best, learning from each other, adapting, surviving." Chuck Joerger passed away in 2003 at the age of 77, and his obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of barrier gunnery or tactical innovations or the day a terrified teenager accidentally changed combat doctrine. It mentioned his 46-year marriage to Dorothy, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren, his work as a civil engineer on bridges and highways across Ohio, his love of fishing and his terrible jokes, and his insistence on attending church every Sunday, even though he admitted he wasn't entirely sure what he believed anymore. But here is what that obituary couldn't capture. What statistics and after-action reports and military histories will never fully convey. That on April 5, 1945, a 19-year-old farm kid from Ohio, flying his first combat mission, too scared to think straight and too desperate to follow the rules, proved something fundamental about human nature. He proved that the most important innovations often come not from experts with decades of experience, but from beginners who don't yet know what's impossible. He proved that terror and desperation can be teachers as effective as any classroom. That survival instinct can access solutions that rational analysis would never consider. He proved that every person, regardless of age or experience or background, carries within them the capacity to see patterns others have missed, to imagine solutions others haven't conceived, to change the world in small but meaningful ways when circumstances demand it. Chuck Joerger didn't set out to be a hero or an innovator or a person whose name would appear in Air Force tactical manuals. He set out to survive one mission, to protect his crew, to do his job well enough that everyone could go home. And in pursuing that simple, human, universal goal, he stumbled upon something that would echo through generations, would save lives he'd never know about, would prove that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances are capable of genuine genius. That is the lesson his story teaches, the truth that connects his experience to every challenge we face in our own lives, that we are all, every one of us, 19 years old and terrified, and flying into something we've never faced before. And sometimes when we stop trying to do things the way we're supposed to, and start trusting the instincts that evolution and experience have given us, we discover that we're capable of far more than we ever imagined. Chuck Joerger was nobody special. He was everybody special. He was proof that heroism isn't about being fearless, innovation isn't about being brilliant, and history isn't made by people who are different from us. It's made by people exactly like us, who found themselves in impossible situations and somehow, against all odds and all expectations, figured out a way forward. That's the real story. That's the story that matters. That's the story we need to remember.